Welcome to another edition of the H podcast. We hope you're all doing well at home. And if you haven't listened to it already, we previously did a podcast on life in lockdown. But today the topic will be centred around the Black Lives Matter movement and the overwhelming public response to the death of George Floyd. So today we have the entire H podcast team with us, and that includes Yasmin.
Hi.
Ariam.
Hi.
Joe.
Hi.
Bobby.
Hi.
Anika.
Hi.
Caris. Destiny.
Hi.
And myself. And before we get started, I just want to introduce our guest speakers today. And we have Mrs. Hannon.
Hi.
Mrs. Downer.
Hello.
And Mrs. Bishop.
Hello.
So first of all, just thank you for being here and being part of this discussion. And
no problem.
We would just like to start with, so what was your initial response to the death of George Floyd, and did you think that it would lead to such a huge public response?
Okay, so my initial response, obviously, it was horrific. My initial response was, I can't believe this is still happening. I moved to Wolverhampton in 1987 to do my degree, and in 1987 a young man called Clinton McKerbin was killed just after being arrested outside Next, and died of asphyxiation. And my introduction to moving here was joining a protest about that, which obviously is a long time ago, before any of you were born. So my initial response, after the initial horror, is just, I can't believe this is still happening. I'm still having to protest against this type of horror.
Yeah. I think I would agree with you as well, Miss Bishop. It's just that shock and huge disappointment that something like that can still happen in the 21st century. Yeah. That it's something so barbaric and it's just so terribly sad and wrong.
In terms of my response, I'd echo what Miss Hannon and Miss Bishop has said, but mine was probably more a mixture of sadness and anger. And my anger, yes, directed at the police officers, but possibly even more so at the fact that there were so many people, police officers and members of the public, watching what was happening for such a long time, that my thought throughout the whole thing, I didn't watch the whole thing because I couldn't, but my thought throughout it was, why is nobody helping? Yeah. Why is that allowed to happen? Why is no one saying anything? Because it wasn't just one police officer there. There were 4 together. Why did no one do anything?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, because it was recorded and it was put up on the internet, and people are outraged at the police officers, but at the same time there were just so many members of the public who could have done something and it could have been prevented. And I think that's just, so it's very, very sad, and it does make people very frustrated and very angry. And in response to this, it was a catalyst for the protests, and as the protests have gone on, kind of what do you think of everyone coming together, and what was your response to just the overwhelming amount of community that's been seen?
Do you want to take this, Miss Downer, or?
No, you go, madam.
Okay. Overwhelmingly for me, it's been the positivity that's come out, and to turn that anger into something. I mean, anger obviously is the overriding emotion here, but to turn that into something positive. Now, whether that, you were talking about the escalation of it, whether that would have happened had we not been in lockdown, that sort of focus, and I'm pleased it has happened, that the movement has taken off the way it has, because it needed to happen. You can't keep a lid on that kind of injustice and that persecution and it not bubble over. Obviously there are some undesirable elements as well, like what's been happening at the weekend, but overwhelmingly positive, I think. Yeah,
I would agree. I think the interesting thing for me at home, we've been really careful with what we've been watching throughout this whole lockdown period, because it gets a bit fraught and all a bit bleak. But I was proud, sounds the wrong word to use, but both of my children watched footage on their phones and devices, and they were absolutely appalled by it. They came to me and asked, "Is this real?" And I was very surprised by that, about how naive they were perhaps to the world and some of the things that happen in it here and abroad. And it's been a real period of, a bit of awakening in our household as to very unpleasant things that you have to explain to your children and get them to understand. And my daughter particularly has been really distressed by it and appalled by it.
Yeah.
That's been quite interesting. When I say proud, I mean I shouldn't have to be proud of that reaction. It shouldn't need to take place, but it's just, I'm probably drifting away from the original question there, but I think yes, all of these protests needed to happen. They're bubbling under the surface anyway. It's I think it's a really, really important time for people, and their voices need to be heard.
I completely agree. I think in terms of the protests, what I find incredibly positive is that people are uniting together, regardless of who they are, regardless of their race, regardless of their religion, regardless of anything. They're uniting together against racism. So it's everybody against racism. And it's not one particular race that's doing this when it comes to the protests. All races are doing this because they see the bigger picture. And in terms of the protests, I would look at them in a very positive way. And obviously the protests have taken lots of different forms. And in the position that we're in, we don't advocate violence, but all forms have their space, is what I'm going to say, or place.
I think that's really important what you just said in terms of a bigger picture as well, because even at this time with the pandemic, I mean, the statistics there within figures of illness and death rates, that, I mean, it's a massive picture. It's a really, really big picture that has to be addressed. It really has to be addressed. Some of the, just entrenched inequalities.
Yes, definitely. And they have been brought to the fore. These entrenched inequalities have been brought to the fore. And what I found incredibly interesting is people who wouldn't usually speak out about what's happened to them have now got the courage and the confidence to be able to do that.
Yeah.
If that doesn't indicate systems that have issues in terms of systematic racism, I don't know what does. If it has taken for something like this for people to feel that they can now have the confidence to come out and have those conversations about race, have those conversations about what's happened to them, then that obviously is a positive thing that has come out of all of this.
Yeah, and I've got a question in relation to people speaking out. and that's the younger generation. So how do you think the younger generation have dealt with leading these protests? Because for us, in the younger people, this is probably the first protest and movement that we've seen in our lifetime. So how do you think that they've dealt with leading them?
What was the question? How do we think you've dealt with?
How do you think the younger generation have dealt with leading the protests in America, for example?
I've heard a lot of fantastic speakers. I'm not sure about the demographic, the age group. How I'm not sure about the age group, but you know, it's your generation. Obviously, you've got to take this, and I know that the local protest was organised by an ex-student, Shireen Walker. I'm not sure how old she is, but I mean, she's a young person compared to me. But she, I know Shireen organised that, and that's fantastic to see. But yeah, I don't know the actual, you know, figures.
There seems to be quite a lot of young people involved in these protests. So we don't know the age range of them or anything, but it does seem quite a young clientele. And actually, isn't that positive? Because you lot are the ones that are going to shape our future. Ultimately, there have been protests throughout history. There has been protests regarding the treatment of Black people, not just the hands of the police, but in terms of the systems. There have been protest after protest after protest. And while certain things have changed, it's very clear other things have not. And so actually the fact that this is a young group of people that seem to be leading these protests, that's an incredibly positive thing, because you lot are going to have to find a way of making changes that previous protests have not.
Yeah, and I think it's really important for younger people to understand kind of concerns about kind of racial profiling, you know, looking at sort of employment figures and all sorts of things. All of that just be examined by young people, because they've got the longest time in it and the most chance of changing it and addressing some of those inequalities.
Yeah. And the biggest difference, obviously, that your generation's got is you're filming everything. You know, we've never had this before, where I think it was Will Smith, was it? He said, you know, nothing's changed. It's just now it's being filmed.
Yeah.
You know, we've not had that before. Any footage like the protest I was talking about in 1987. You know, there's no real record of it. There's just a couple of still photographs from the Express and Star. Whereas you've got this record and this huge resource at your fingertips. I think that's the main difference.
But then one of the terrifying things is the fact that, I mean, clearly the police officers knew that they were going to be filmed and they just didn't seem to care. There was like a complete understanding that maybe there wasn't going to be repercussions that they expected.
Yeah.
Sorry, carry on, Miss Hannon.
I was going to say that's one of the biggest things that I was trying to explain to my daughter, because that's the bit she couldn't get her head around. What you mentioned before, people standing and watching, just that arrogance and disregard for a person's human rights. I mean, I think it's a struggle to understand, isn't it? And that's what the problem is. You see, Joe, there's where the problem lies, isn't it? In that it's that sense of not feeling that there are repercussions, or I mean, to me, that's what the issue is, really. That just disregard.
There's no justice. They don't feel that they will be held to account, even though it's been recorded. I think the other thing about the recording, what I find particularly interesting, is the fact that obviously it was quite a young girl, wasn't it, that was recording. Yeah. And she's got lots of negative attention on social media about standing by and recording. Now, I'd just like to mention the fact that, if she didn't record that, none of this would ever have happened. If she hadn't recorded it and shared it, none of it would have happened. And B, if she, as a young girl, tried to do anything, what would have been the repercussions of that?
Yeah. Against about 3 or 4 armed policemen.
Exactly. And I think we need to be careful especially on social media as a society, about people like her. We all know about the issues with mental health as it is, but she was a 17-year-old girl that did the thing that she knows how to do, record something. And she was one of quite a few people at that place. And by her recording it, we have now kick-started this movement and hope for change.
Yeah,
I think that was a really good point, because a lot of people have criticised the people who've been filming it, but it was the responsibility of the police, the people who are put in place to protect the community, to stop something like that happening. And I think the fact that they just stood by and did nothing is it's extremely scary, because how can you feel safe as in a community when you can't trust the people who are meant to protect you?
Again, it sort of has echoes of Stephen Lawrence and, you know, all those awful situations when the very people you put your trust in betray you.
Yeah.
I think I may have to go now because I'm on some sort of a lunch duty in school. But it's been really interesting talking to you all.
Yeah, thanks for coming.
Yeah, thanks, Madam, for being here. It was very insightful to have your input into this podcast.
Yeah, and it makes me very proud knowing all of you that you are interested and concerned by all of this, because you know you can shape your world. You can help to, you know, promote change, no matter how small it is or what it leads to. But it's just good to be conscious of what's happening around you.
Thank you, Madam.
Yeah, no problem. Take care.
Bye, Madam.
You too.
Bye.
I think Destiny had another question.
Hi. As we were talking about earlier, there's been an overwhelming amount of support for the Black Lives Movement from all types of people, all types of ages. But recently, there have been people who still disagree with the whole movement. So what's your opinion on these people who are protesting in response to the Black Lives Matter?
Well, if you're talking about what happened at the weekend, there's a large element of people who are using this as an excuse to push an agenda which is nothing to do really with the cause. And the people that we saw who were, you know, drinking and just being violent for the sake of it, they didn't even have an agenda. Some of them were just going to have a fight, which is extremely depressing that people want to behave like that. But I think that, you know, that there's different strands. That there are the people who want the statues to stay. That's one strand. There are people who, you know, come out with this doesn't every life matter, who are clearly just not understanding the issue and need to be educated. So there are different sort of strands of people who aren't on board with the cause. But you know, there are lots of things you could discuss. Like, I'm from Bristol, so I went to school in Bristol. So seeing Colston statue pulled down was particularly exciting for me. Teenager, when I was your age, we were signing petitions and protesting against the things that are in Bristol. That, I mean, there's a road in Bristol, would you believe, one of the main roads is called White Ladies Road, which leads to Black Boy Hill. We were protesting about that in the 80s, and probably before me, people were in the 60s, I imagine. Colston Hall, which is where all the concerts were, I thought they changed the name of that years ago, but they haven't. So that again is being petitioned. You know, so they've sleptwalked into this, if you like. You know, they had plenty of time to do something with that statue, put it in a museum, at the very least put a plaque on it explaining the atrocities and the context of it. So, you know, it depends which strand of people you're talking about disagreeing with there are many arguments and discussions to be had, I think.
I'll agree with you, Madam, there. I think there are different strands of disagreement here that you can actually have a debate over. So if I think about it, the statues, you can have a debate over that. Like, there are people out there that will very much argue for keeping Colston's statue there, along with lots of others, and there'll be people that argue against. That can be a debate. That's something that, like, a debating society at school would be it'd be really good to have that debate. There's other things to debate about as well. Protests, peaceful or violent, debate about that, the importance of peaceful, violent protests. There's debate there. However, there are, in my eyes, some things you cannot debate about. And one of the things that I don't think there is a debate about is racism and the fact that racism needs to be eradicated. That is not up for debate, not from my eyes. And I don't know whether I'm allowed to say that or not, but I'm saying it anyway. That isn't up for debate. There are other things as elements of this that are.
Yeah, good point.
Yeah,
When
Madam,
you
I
say-
think you can.
When you
Sorry,
say that,
Joe.
the fact that there's some people who feel the need to go out and protest over what was a pretty visceral video of a murder and of a lynching, and yet some people who really shunned that movement, but now they actually feel the need to go out and protest over some statues. Isn't that a bit of a discrepancy, that people care more about a piece of metal than, you know, human lives that have clearly been killed?
I don't think. Sorry, go on, Miss Downer.
Sorry, I was going to say completely agree. However, with those people, you can have kind of discussions. The thing is that once their discussions then are very clearly not founded in factual evidence or points, you know that really the discussions are because really deep down in the core they have some shall we say, questionable morals themselves.
Good way of putting it, Madam. Do you mean that people shouldn't be protesting against the statues? They should be protesting against the wider issue. Do you mean there's no place to protest against the statues?
I understand why you'd protest to say I'm in support of statues, but I don't really understand why you would keep silent through a video of a man getting killed and then, you know, 2 weeks later see a bit of graffiti on a statue and think this is something that I need to take a stand against.
Absolutely. Well, I think, yeah, I mean, those people, like I say, I think they had a different agenda, and you've got it can't be too you've got, what should we call them, Madam? Extreme right-wing groups.
Extreme right-wing groups.
Extreme right-wing groups who are pushing their own agenda with very little thought behind it. I mean, we had a couple of years ago in Wolverhampton, Britain First, who are a far right-wing group. We heard on social media that they were coming to demonstrate in town, and some of us went up to counter protest them. So the police were sort of between us, and we protested their agenda. And they have nothing to say of any, intelligence. One of them is in prison currently, I think, for inciting racial hatred. But they have nothing intelligent to say. There's no real argument behind what they're saying. So it's all. You have to consider them because they're being, they're the people who are being violent, but they don't really have anything. It's difficult to engage with them, is what I'm saying, I suppose.
Yeah. I mean, those ones that you're mentioning there, Mrs. Bishop, are the ones that seem to be incredibly extreme, and really they don't want to accept that they are racist. A lot of them, they won't say that they're racist, but their policies and the way and their mannerisms suggest that they are. Now, not all groups that are against Black Lives Matter are like that. And I think that's so important to consider as well. So you have the extreme right, but you also have some other people who are against Black Lives Matter for lots of different reasons as well. And I think looking at those reasons, I find incredibly interesting, because they look at it in alternative ways, and it's trying to sort of understand your own views, looking at alternative views and why they have alternative views. And I'm not discussing the extremes of both sides here. Yeah. I'm talking about both sides. And I think, especially at the start of all of this, when it first happened, I was emotionally unavailable to accept both sides. But as time is going by, it's interesting to listen to both sides, even if it is to validate your own even more. If that makes more sense, to validate your own even more.
Yeah. So there are people who might not agree with Black Lives Matter that you can engage with and have a discussion with. But they tend to be more extreme views. I'd like Miss Downer, if you can, can you think of an example of somebody who's perhaps not for Black Lives Matter but that isn't extreme?
Well, yeah. So there's this woman. I don't know if any of you've ever heard of her. She runs the strictest school in Britain. Her name is Catherine Birbal Singh. So her name is Catherine Birbal Singh, strictest woman in Britain. And her views are very interesting. She is a lady of colour as well, a person of colour. I think she's mixed heritage, half Black Caribbean and half Asian. Head teacher, has very conservative views. I say very conservative mainly. But she asks very challenging questions. She was on Sky News the other day. She was on the BBC. So yeah, looking at her would be interesting if you follow her on Twitter, because there's some days where I'm like, oh, I see her point, and others days where I'm like, I need to unfollow this woman. So you kind of, yeah, she's an interesting one, Catherine Birbal Singh.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting how you mentioned the aspects of debate that come into this whole conversation about Black Lives Matter and the different views. And I think especially with our generation, a lot of our response came from an increase in knowledge about the topic, because before this all happened, we may not have realised the true gravity of the situation. And I think Arian had some questions about education and what can be done maybe to educate the younger generation on the issues that people are facing all around the world in terms of race.
Hi. So I was going to ask, especially like with Miss Downer being in humanities and Miss Bishop being in performing arts, that is there a way that we can, on a smaller scale, almost educate people on not just extreme like racism, but as well with the casual racism, because there's a lot of like racist remarks and things going around a lot in school, outside of school, which people don't realise that they're saying. So I think, is there like a way that we can improve on this, like even a small change, which we can do in school, can make all the difference?
Yeah, I think there needs to be some sort of, well, there is. I mean, as a school, from what I see, and I can't speak for Miss Bishop here, the vast majority of interaction seems incredibly positive amongst races. That's what I see. I don't know about you, Miss Bishop. But in terms strategically, like to look across the whole school and everything that we do, I think there is a place for us to revisit maybe what we do as a school, especially in light of the current situation, which is obviously on the top of everyone's list of discussion at the moment. So yeah, I think there's something we can do strategically. In terms of classroom, like history, drama and so on, we do bits and pieces already, and citizenship. And I'd like to think the assembly programme touches on quite a lot as well. But I do know that the history curriculum, for example, is currently being adapted. So you should see more things that you will find relevant there over the coming years, definitely.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very sad to hear you say that, you know, racist comments and so forth happen outside of school, and that perhaps we're not aware of them. But like Madam says, overwhelmingly it seems positive. But I think there's always things we can do, and there's always stuff we should be doing, looking at, for my subject, making sure that we're not only teaching white playwrights, in the same way that we make sure we're not only teaching male playwrights, and that we're not just representing one section of society. I mean, when I trained as a drama teacher, I remember you're always taught, for example, that the roots of drama come from the ancient Greeks. Well, of course, there are loads of civilizations who have performance for thousands of years before the Greeks, Aboriginal performance styles and so on. So that's what people were taught traditionally, that the roots of Western drama were what we should all follow. And it was much later, really, when I worked in a theatre company, a women's theatre company actually, who they educated me about the actual roots of theatre, and that's when I really started to learn about my subject. So yeah, there's always stuff we can do. We should never stop learning ourselves, educating ourselves, and as teachers, and making sure that the curriculum is relevant and updated.
Oh, completely. And to go back to your point as well, is it Arian?
Yeah.
Yeah, to go back to your point as well, Arian, when you said about people doing things that necessarily aren't overtly racist, but subtly racist, and making comments like that, I think we need to as well ensure that our students know that anything that they feel uncomfortable with needs to be reported. There has been a safeguarding update gone out as well this week with regards to Black Lives Matter, but it's incredibly important because, like I say, from my perspective, having been a teacher at Highfield for more years than I'd like to even count, it seems like a very sort of, diverse, tolerant, cohesive environment. But if things are happening and aren't being reported, it's incredibly important that students know that that's what they should do. So on that point, I'd like to make that. And then the second point I'd like to also say is about history. Miss Bishop was just mentioning about white male playwrights and making sure that actually the books and the plays that are being read and carried out are actually from a more diverse background. In terms of history, we do always insist that if we do cover topics like slavery, for example, we never suggest that the Black experience starts there, and it's always important to us, whether through assemblies, through discussions or in class, that we actually deal with the true Black experience. And what we've been doing as a history department actually is looking at Black British experience rather than Black American experience over the time that we have been off school. And the reason for that is quite often people are used to the names like Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, and a lesser extent Malcolm X, but less so on Black British people who have actually shaped our history as well, because Black British history is all of our histories and needs to be taught as such.
Yeah, I was just thinking just the small things make a larger change in the future. It's like if someone's educated now about something that they might not realize is wrong, later in the future it just narrows that effect of racism.
Yeah, and I think quite often we assume young people know, but they don't always know. And so that's an interesting point, Arian, completely taken on board.
I think for my subject, sorry, go on.
Yeah, I was just going to ask another question.
Sure.
Obviously, the whole point of protesting was to kind of trigger that change in society. So do you think that there is going to be a change, and do you think society has the ability to kind of move forward?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think there's already a change, but what's got to, obviously we've been here before in history, in America, like Madam says, and in this country, in this, the 60s, the 80s, particularly I'm thinking of, you know, the riots in the 80s and the civil rights movement in the 60s. But what's got to change this time is it's got to move for, you know, we had the Me Too movement for women, but it's got to change in legislation, in the law. So we've got to grasp this moment and not just let it die down again, and it's got to change. We've got to push now for it to happen in legislation. Yeah. Can't say that word, sorry. And
because you know what, it's all well and good having the sort of blackouts on Instagram and everybody joining like these little BLM protest groups and like sharing things. That's, I mean, it is good. It is waking some people up. It is, but it's not going to change the experience for Black people in Britain and the world just by waking a few people up. Yes, there needs to be change in legislation, like Miss Bishop says, but you know, you lot are spot on. It's the heart of it. It's the little indiscretions, the everyday racism, as well as the systematic racism that needs to change. And the age-old story is the people who are in power currently may feel they have a lot to lose if so much is changed. And so it's about convincing, in a way, for me, it is partly about convincing people that we shouldn't be striving for equality. Equality should just happen. But also it's about making sure that those who have the abilities to make those changes actually are on side too and understand that they aren't threatened just because other people will have equity. That's my perspective of it.
Good point. Yeah, it's taking away the threat, and the only way you can do that is by educating people, which obviously starts with us in schools, but you know, it has to be much bigger than that, and everyone has a responsibility to change this.
Yeah, exactly. And then there are, you know, I'm not being negative here, but there are people that aren't going to be changed. And it's about where our energies are then put. There are people that aren't going to be changed. And I'm not talking about young people here. I believe young people's minds are versatile. We're not here to change your minds. We're here to sort of open your minds, to get you to question and think and debate. That's what we're here for. But in terms of some people out there, their minds are set.
And a lot of people think it doesn't affect them, you know, well, it's nothing to do with me. And it affects everyone because it's our society, and nobody should want to live in a society where there isn't equality. You know, and it's this thing of apathy, isn't it? Well, can I be bothered? You know, it's not enough anymore to say, well, I'm not racist. You have to be anti-racist. You have to stand up, you know, and be brave. And if you're here, starting with name calling and the everyday racism, you have to stand up to it and call it out. You have to.
Yeah, completely. And it's about us all being human, isn't it? It's about us all being human beings. We are all human beings. Yes, we have different races, we have different cultures, we have different religions, but we're all human beings. Anyone that wants to highlight our differences are the ones with a problem. Yes, we are different and we should embrace those differences, but anyone that wants to highlight them to create divisions are the problem.
Yeah, thank you.
Joe, did you have a question?
Okay, I'll just one more thing, because one of the uplifting things about this whole movement has been the multiracial calls for change. However, unfortunately, you know, there have been some statements from people our age, and I think all of us would just like a moment to sort of respond to them. So firstly, a shamefully common suggestion that George Floyd was an American killed in America, so us in Britain shouldn't care. Now, I don't know, maybe this is just me when I watched that video, but my reaction to seeing him killed and hearing his pleas for his already dead mother, as he was lynched in daylight, was not, it's in America, so I don't care. And there's no doubt that racial injustice indeed does plague America. And I think the documentary 13th is probably the best depiction of that. And I think that's mandatory viewing in living rooms and in classrooms. And in that documentary, it cites racial discrepancies in the criminal justice system as a root cause of injustice. But we cannot be naive enough to think that those discrepancies don't occur this side of the Atlantic also. So for example, 51% of people in young offender institutes are from BME backgrounds versus just 14% of the actual population in that demographic. And if that's not indicative of systemic repression, then I'm not sure what is. But the most shocking public sentiment from someone my age was someone who was dismayed at how her boyfriend couldn't come near her whilst protesters were allowed to stand shoulder to shoulder in acts of solidarity against systemic racism and its tragic consequences. And these were views that were expressed publicly. And this is an egregious blend of ignorance and selfishness. And now they've been exposed as callous and, yes, arguably as racist. No one will want to come near them ever again. Because ultimately, white ignorance breeds violence. And as such, on the hands of all who think like this will be the blood of the next Breonna Taylor, or the next Tamir Rice, or the next Ahmaud Arbery, or the next Michael Brown, or the next Robert Fuller, who, by the way, was found just last week lynched from a tree in California, or the next Trayvon Martin, or indeed the next George Floyd. And as I list these names, I'm reminded of a Kendrick Lamar lyric. The one in front of the gun lives forever. For whilst the names of those who hate and kill will be forgotten, those of those who are racistly hated and tragically killed, including those listed moments ago, and innumerable others, both in America and, yes, here in Britain, will endure immortally, reverberating through history forever. Louise.
Wow, thank you, Joe. That was extremely powerful and very. I think a lot of the things you said just absolutely hit home and just encapsulated everything that's been going on, not even just the past few weeks, but for years and years. And I think this is just a catalyst that has just led to people being just sick of this treatment in society. And yeah, I think that's all the questions and all the statements we have for today. So I just want to thank all of our guest speakers for coming here today and contributing such profound, insightful things.
Thank you so much for inviting us, Joe. That was absolutely amazing summary. And thanks, Louise, for organising it.
Thank you, guys.
You're welcome.
Thanks for inviting us.
Thank you.